Okay, hi everyone. My name is Sandra Khalil. I'm an associate at All Tech is Human. I have the distinct honor to introduce our first panel on digital governance and tech policy. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the moderator, who will then bring our panelists up and introduce them. Omar Aziz is an author, lawyer, Radcliffe Fellow at Harvard University, and former foreign policy advisor in Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's administration. He is the author of Brown Boy, a memoir coming out this April, creator of Minority Views podcast, and a regular contributor to newspapers and magazines around the world. At Harvard, Omar is working on a book about the reemergence of fascism in America. Please join me in welcoming him and the panelists.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Sandra, for that very kind introduction. Thank you, David. Thank you, Saliu. Thank you to Consul General Clark. And most importantly, thank you to all of you, our participants, and everyone watching at home. My name is Omar Aziz. I was a foreign policy advisor in the Trudeau administration and worked for the current Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, as well as at PMO. And it's my distinct honor to welcome and moderate our first panel. Jamil Jaffer is the executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Under his leadership, the Institute has filed precedent-setting litigation, undertaken major disciplinary research initiatives, and become an influential voice in debates about the freedom of speech and the press in the digital age. Katie Harbath is a global leader at the intersection of elections, democracy, and technology. As the chief executive of Anchor Change, she helps clients think through tech policy issues. She's a senior advisor for technology and democracy at the International Republican Institute, and is also a fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Integrity Institute, and a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Nicole Gill is co-founder and executive director of Accountable Tech, an advocacy organization focused on repairing our information ecosystems to foster a healthier and more equitable democracy, where she leads organizational development and strategy. Since its launch in May 2020, Accountable Tech has helped pass the California Age Appropriate Design Code, pressured Facebook to turn off its toxic group recommendation system ahead of the 2020 elections, and launched an international coalition calling for a ban on surveillance advertising. Please join me in welcoming Jamil Jaffer, Katie Harbath, and Nicole Gill. Thank you. So I kind of want to get right into it, and my mind is on Section 230. I know the Supreme Court has taken it up. It's been called the 26 words that created the modern internet. And I want to start with our panelist, Jamil Jaffer. How important are the discussions right now, the Supreme Court on Section 230, and what are the implications for what might happen if Section 230 is repealed?
Okay, so first, thank you for the invitation, and thanks to the Consul General and to Accountable Tech for inviting me. All Tech is Human, sorry. I grew up in Canada. I always appreciate the chance to engage with Canadian political debate, so this is great. But your question is not about Canada. It's about Section 230, which is obviously an American law. I think these cases before the U.S. Supreme Court right now are hugely important cases, that they have the potential to totally reshape public discourse online. You know, they're nominally not about the Constitution at all. They're about this statute, Section 230, or at least one of the two cases about Section 230, and the other one is about intermediary liability and a statute relating to aiding and abetting terrorism. So they're statutory cases, not constitutional cases, but I think they are as important as any First Amendment case could be. I think that a lot of people come to these questions, especially people who have, who are not in tech policy or in thinking about free speech all the time, come to these questions thinking, isn't the solution obvious? Isn't the solution just make the platforms accountable for the speech of the people, the speech of third parties? Why should the platforms enjoy immunity that the New York Times doesn't enjoy? Why shouldn't they be on the hook when they publish misinformation or they publish defamatory content? And that's a totally understandable starting place. I think that's the starting place certainly my starting place. But as you get into these issues, you quickly realize that it's a little bit more complicated than that, because to hold the platforms directly accountable for the speech of third parties would mean that the platforms would take down a lot of socially valuable speech. So that's what makes these cases hard. I think more broadly, these cases do present the court, maybe for the first time, with this landscape in which there are two really big threats. One of the threats has to do with government power. This threat that the government will control public discourse, which is a threat that I think American courts are very used to thinking about. But the other threat here is the threat that public platforms, the private platforms, will control public discourse. And this is a threat that has come up over the years, but I think never been presented as sharply as it is in these cases. So the cases are important in their own right, but they will also tell us a lot, I think, about how the Supreme Court will address other issues at the intersection of free speech and new technology.
Yeah, Katie, I wonder if you can jump in and respond to that. Are the dangers greater in potentially over-regulating and over-legislating in terms of unintended consequences? Does that worry you?
Yeah, and I also want to thank you so much to All Tech is Human and the Canadian Consulate for having us as a Wisconsinite. I consider myself an honorary Canadian. But yes, I do worry a lot about the unintended consequences. And I agree with Jamil about the worry about repealing Section 230 and the consequences that could have of more speech coming down than what we really want it to be. And I'm more in the camp right now, really, that I think that we need more transparency to even still fully understand what the problems are that we're trying to solve. And then I think the other challenge that we have with this is nobody feels comfortable with any one entity having control. And so I think what we need to get to a point of is how do we build the right checks and balances, the right types of oversight and everything that can happen. And how do we build into, and this is some of the work we're trying to do through the Integrity Institute with people that are still at the platforms, is how do we help them have the skill sets and the tools and the support they need in the integrity and trust and safety space to be trying to think about how they build these tools more responsibly and think about those unintended consequences before they actually put something out into the world.
What do you think of the argument that I hear from skeptics that your former company that you worked at, Meta, has gotten too big and that we need direct government regulation and intervention, and some are even saying break it up?
Well, I think there's definitely a role for government regulation. That doesn't mean that all regulation is good. So, right, when I kind of get a little frustrated where they're like, Meta says they want regulation, but then they're fighting against this regulation. Well, some of that they probably shouldn't be, and I would disagree with them on that. But there are other ones too that I think that there are areas where the government should play a role. Like if the US government finally wants to define what a political ad is and an issue ad is, I would love that. That would be awesome. But I think there's other areas where technology is just going to keep moving faster as well. And then on the question of breaking them up or not, I don't know if that's going to solve the things that people think it's necessarily going to solve, but I don't feel strongly one way or the other, in all honesty.
I want to get Nicole in here to talk about frameworks versus content. So there's one approach to this that we can just regulate content and regulate directly, but is there a design approach to think about privacy and transparency and safety?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Also happy to be back on my home soil, so to speak. I think that's exactly right. And I support most of what Katie just said too about the role that government can play. And I think what we're starting to have a little bit more of a nuanced conversation publicly now, but we haven't for a long time, about what is design-oriented regulation and law look like versus dealing with the after effects of these platforms. And we've spent 2 decades dealing with the after effects. There's been very little regulation, and I think this is where government can play a role with input from technologists and civil society and the like to build incentives for these companies. Because right now there is no internal incentive. I mean, Katie, you know better than anyone, like your bonus probably, right, was rated on like KPIs, and those weren't related to trust and safety. They weren't related to kind of design standards. And so I think that is something that we should be looking more at. I don't necessarily think this Congress is going to do that, but that's the role I would hope that government can play.
What are some of those incentives? What would you advise? Like this device in my hand right now is designed to addict me and keep me on it for as long as possible. And so are most of the apps. From a design perspective, what would you advise in terms of reshaping those incentives?
Well, I'm not a technologist. I can also barely use my phone. But I'll point to two pieces of law that have passed. One is the Digital Services Act that was passed by the European Union last year and is starting to go into effect. And some of the basic principles of that is it makes what is illegal offline illegal online. It requires platforms, they're given 24 hours to remove something that they are notified is illegal. If they haven't done it within 24 hours, they receive a fine. Those are pretty clear incentives to make a change. The other piece of legislation is the California Age Appropriate Design Code, which sets in place a certain set of standards. It's 15 standards that online services or apps or platforms that are likely to be accessed by children have to reach. And these are basic things that if you're a parent, you would be shocked to know are possible. You can, for instance, up until recently, a stranger could often direct message a 13-year-old on a platform that they're not connected to. So things like that, where we're not telling you how to do it, nor should government probably ever do that, but we're setting a standard that we want you to get to.
Jamila, I think a lot of people are worried, both on the left and the right, of governments regulating speech, as they should be. So if that's one approach, governments regulating speech, are there structural approaches and structural interventions that states, private entities can take to ensure greater transparency and safety?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that, for reasons I already alluded to, I would be uncomfortable with, opposed to regulation that directly implicated content. So for example, a regulation that said the platforms must take down misinformation and we're going to define it this way, or we're going to empower this person to say what misinformation is or isn't. But there are many other possibilities. Structural is one way to think of them. Regulation that requires the platforms to be more transparent about how they're shaping public discourse, regulation that limits the platform's ability to prevent journalists and researchers from studying what they're doing, which is something that's going on all the time now. Platforms are using their terms of service as a way of shutting down legitimate investigations. Privacy legislation that would limit what the platforms can collect and what they can do with it, antitrust action, interoperability legislation. There are all sorts of structural possibilities that don't give government officials the power to dictate what stays up and what comes down.
Yeah. What about this issue of data sets and privacy around that? So when a platform like Twitter, for example, is sold to a certain individual who's very, very wealthy, and then that individual can own a lot of that data, like how should people be thinking about this in particular when private entities and large firms are bought and sold, and what happens to that data?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a piece, it's a complicated question that is part of a larger discussion about what privacy legislation should look like, right? And I think that that conversation is way overdue in the United States. I mean, many different NGOs have been trying to have that conversation for a long time. Unfortunately, Congress has not been that enthusiastic about it. Now we're seeing efforts by the states and maybe even Congress to shut down foreign social media, right, that is accessible to American citizens, in part on the theory that China has access to, to all of this data. And all that is kind of a tail wagging dog problem, because if we had privacy legislation that restricted what these companies could collect in the first instance, we wouldn't have to start thinking about giving the government or giving state governors the authority to tell Americans which platforms they can and can't access.
Plus the fact that every other one of these tech companies has that data as well. They're just not owned by a Chinese firm. It's the same. Facebook has it, Twitter has it, it's all the same.
ByteDance could buy it if they didn't have TikTok. Right?
Exactly.
And Katie, just given that the US government banned or is in the process of banning TikTok for its agencies and staffers, and I believe in Canada it's been banned for staffers as well, we should zoom out a little bit. Let's take a global look at this now when it comes to privacy and global platforms internationally. There's many elections coming next year. I believe I would call it a tsunami of elections. Yes. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, so next year is going to be the first time ever that the world has seen in the same year a US presidential election, in addition to elections in India, Indonesia, Ukraine, Taiwan, Mexico, the United Kingdom, and the European Parliament. In addition, I think there's in total 60-ish some that are going to be happening next year. So it's not only going to be a huge geopolitical moment, but it's also going to be, that's a lot of fronts to fight these various issues happening, not just online, but also offline. That same year too, Europe is going to be starting to implement the DSA. The Supreme Court will have the Supreme Court rulings on the recent cases, but it's likely the Supreme Court's going to take up the Texas and Florida bills. That ruling could come down in the middle of that election. And so, I think it's really important to think about these things globally, because different countries do, like, I think this TikTok ban, for instance, a lot of people I would imagine, took some cue from the United States making its move. For the EU, then Canada. I saw the UK pulled back. One thing I do worry about, though, is America, I'll talk for America, but I'd say any democracy going the route of starting to shut things down, of saying what is or is not allowed, because I start to worry about the signal that is sending to other countries and leaders around the world. And it's getting worse. VDEM, which is a organization that measures democracy, has their next report coming out tomorrow, and they tweeted out this morning, autocracies are at an all-time high with 42 countries, up from 31 last year. And so we've got our work cut out for ourselves, and I think we do need to make sure that we think about the implications of the decisions that we're making for our individual countries and what that can do globally.
I think this is a huge issue, and I want to get Jamil and Nicole on this as well. Just the number of countries that are autocracies or backsliding democracies, giving those states the power to regulate free speech within their borders is a form of censorship and shutting down speech. So how should we be thinking about countries like China, countries like India that are moving, Mr. Modi's moving in a more authoritarian direction when the world is going in this direction? How should we be thinking about free speech in authoritarian autocracies?
Well, I mean, one small part of the answer to that question is this is a place where American technology companies can be, for lack of a better phrase, part of the solution. American technology companies are often in the position of, or often have the choice between defending the rights of their users, the human rights of their users, or at least the free speech rights of their users, and caving to these autocratic regimes. And I think it's worth thinking about what the rest of us can do to both empower and incentivize the platforms to play that, play that role. When you see the platforms change ownership, you often see a pretty dramatic change in the way that the platforms are dealing with, say India, right? And that's a terrible thing. Like people's, state the obvious, people's lives are at stake here, and they're very courageous people in places like India who are fighting for human rights and for democracy, and whose lives are then put on the line by the platform's unwillingness to stand up for them. And maybe there is legislation that Canada or the United States could consider to it would have the effect of putting more pressure on the platforms to stand up for their users in those kinds of circumstances. I don't have any brilliant proposals as to like what that would look like, but at the very least, some forms of transparency, mandated transparency, might put some pressure on the platforms to do more in those kinds of situations.
I do want to stay on the topic of TikTok, only because I'm on a university campus right now, and every single student, it seems, especially everyone under the age of 25, is on TikTok, and they're using it a lot, and that's their primary source of information and entertainment. So Nicole, how do we think of, TikTok is ultimately owned by Chinese government, or there is associationship there. How do we think of citizens who live in the West holding companies like TikTok accountable for the content that they put out, especially to children? TikTok's algorithm is different in China than it is in the West. So how do we think about accountability when it comes to companies that are based in authoritarian countries?
Yeah, that's a hard question and probably above my pay grade, because I don't really have an answer to it. Honestly, I think that a lot of this, again, goes back to incentives. And as long as the primary driver of any of these tech companies is profit and power, they're going to make decisions that support their profit and power, right? Their place in society. And TikTok is no different. The other I don't have TikTok. I won't download it because I'm fearful of it. But you know, it's pretty incredible entrepreneurship. Like the algorithm is pretty fucking awesome.
Yeah,
Like
definitely.
the creators did something pretty incredible, and I don't know how they did it. And I also think we need to be considering, the environment in which that entrepreneurship came about. And there's a lot of pieces to it, and it's not just based in China. And figuring out how we encourage that, but also incentivize it for the right motives.
And I would add, in addition to incentives, we need more folks in terms of having that technological background or being able to understand what the companies are saying when they say they're doing something and be able to validate that. And that's a big challenge right now. And I'm hopeful, like if there's any silver lining to all these layoffs, there's a lot of really smart people that are on the job market right now that people should be snapping up to help do this and know the questions that and help governments, academia, to know the questions they should be asking these companies about what they are not doing.
That reminds me of Elena Kagan at the court last week saying, well, these are not the 9 most premier experts on the internet, right? And that group of 9 people is the last people I think we want deciding what happens with our tech policy.
I had a conversation with Noah Feldman at Harvard Law School a few weeks ago, and I believe he was the chairman of the Facebook Oversight Regulatory Board, right? He sort of conceived of it. The question being, can these tech companies have a kind of unofficial or Supreme Court sort of, so to speak, that would make some decisions on, those borderline cases on whether something is offensive or unoffensive?
I like where the oversight board is going overall. I think it is helping to set some case law, but there's some severe challenges also though with the oversight board in that they have the control because Facebook's chosen to give it to them. Facebook could take that away at any point in time. Sorry, and I'm still going to keep calling it Facebook. I was there for 10 years. I can't get out of calling it. I also think too that they only make policy recommendations. They can't force them to make any of those changes. They also have no say over the product and the product design and resources. And so I think there's definitely a role for a platform council type of role that is across a lot of different platforms that can bring in civil society, can help smaller platforms who don't have the resources to engage necessarily with rooms like this because they're doing 5 other jobs on top of everything else that they are doing, and have the heft of the government or some sort of either incentives, but also penalties for the recommendations and the things that they're being told to do.
Jamil, sounds like you wanted to get in on that.
Well, on the oversight board, I guess I was a skeptic initially. I guess I'm still a skeptic, but it has exceeded my low expectations. I think that the oversight board, in part because they recruited really good people. They have, some of the members of the oversight board are, they're all very serious people. They've thought deeply about these issues. They cared not principally about Facebook, but about public discourse. And they're trying really hard to, get these questions right. So, they've exceeded my low expectations, but I don't think the oversight board, and nobody here would suggest this, but I don't think the oversight board is a substitute for any of the regulatory responses we've discussed. I mean, you still need privacy legislation, you need transparency legislation, you need to be able to hold the platforms accountable in court, not just send letters to some board that whose power is entirely derivative of Facebook's. But can I say one thing about TikTok?
Sure. Yes.
So it is nothing new, and we've seen this over and over again all over the world, that governments point to foreign threats to justify the restrictions of rights at home. That doesn't mean every time a government points to a foreign threat, the proposed response is necessarily illegitimate. But it should should lead us to be skeptical, at least initially, of proposals that are meant to address, especially speech restrictive proposals that are meant to respond to foreign threats. And I think it's a real concern in the United States now that so much regulation is introduced in purported response to foreign threats. And we have a case at the Knight Institute right now where we're challenging a rule that requires 14 million visa applicants every year to submit their social media handles to the State Department. And the justification for this is that, well, some people coming into the country mean to do us harm. And that is certainly true. Some people who come into the country mean to do us harm. But this, this law, which requires, or this regulation, which requires 14 million people to submit their social media handles, even if they use those handles, even if they're pseudonymous handles that they use to criticize repressive regimes, they still have to submit them to the State Department. You can imagine that, if you've been using your pseudonymous handle on Twitter to criticize, you're a Saudi citizen, you're criticizing the Saudi regime, and now you have to hand over your real name to the State Department in connection with your social media handle. You probably lose some sleep over that. I could go down a list of other policies that are, nominally meant to address threats from abroad. But the result is a kind of speech restriction on speech rights or on privacy rights. And I kind of see this TikTok stuff in the same way. It's not that there is not a kernel of truth to what the government is saying about the national security threat. I think that there is, but I think a lot of this is not about that kernel of truth. There's some xenophobia tied up in it. There's there's also kind of a competitive opportunity for many other platforms that see TikTok as a real threat, and who wouldn't want to get rid of their competitor in this way. But I think it's a really dangerous thing to empower government officials to decide which communications mediums we use, which ones we have access to, how we can use them, where one of the proposals, mitigation proposals here, is to give the U.S. government control over the algorithm, which in my view would be from the frying pan into the fire. So sorry, it's a very long answer to a question you didn't ask, but this TikTok stuff, I've only started thinking about it relatively recently. I think it's a really big deal. It's emblematic of a larger trend in the United States that is very, very worrying.
Would you be comfortable having TikTok on your phone today?
Look, I'm nervous about having any social media apps on my phone. I'd be nervous about TikTok for slightly different reasons. But at the end of the day, I know that any of these companies can buy my data from data brokers very, very easily. The delta between what data brokers have and what TikTok gets from my swiping videos. I don't use TikTok, but it's not for these reasons. That delta is, I think, pretty small. So if I don't have TikTok on my phone, it's not because I'm worried that by having it there, I'm submitting to censorship by China.
Yeah. Nicole, there's so much disinformation, especially now in YouTube Shorts and TikToks and Reels. It would be a very labor-intensive process to regulate all that. How do you think about regulating millions and millions and millions of hours of content uploaded every day?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And video content is something that we just don't talk about enough in this space. And speaking of TikTok, speaking of Instagram Reels, that is where the companies are moving, right? They're moving, their algorithms are shifting us, whether we want to or not. Those Reels keep showing up in my Instagram feed. And we haven't, the technology, both the AI technology, as well as the human-powered technologists have not caught up to the speed at which we need to be reviewing this content. And that's been exposed, but it really isn't talked about that much. And I think as we move into this new era, especially with increased use of AI, and we're talking about ChatGPT, and we're really falling behind on the tools to, again, going back to the keyword here, transparency, to understand what's happening.
Katie, you're at the Bipartisan Policy Institute, and some of these issues do seem to have bipartisan support. I wonder which of those come to mind in particular, where liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans can come together and actually have bipartisan solutions done.
Well, they agree that they want to do something on tech and they don't like tech. So we were unifying in that way, in their hatred and being frustrated at the tech companies. Unfortunately, that's where some of the bipartisanship, I think, stops at the moment, even though, and where politics starts to enter, because I think that when you get them away from the cameras and you get them to actually start talking, some of them do start to understand that transparency achieves both of the goals that we're trying to achieve and things of that nature. But there's still a fundamental, this right now it's on speech, right? Where the right thinks that too much is being taken down and the left thinks that there's not enough being taken down. And we need to be having some more of those conversations at the root of where the disagreement is. And right now we're talking about, and we should be talking about the tech and the platforms and the right way in which to do some of that. But what's happening online is not our only issues. Let's look what's happening with Fox. Let's look what's happening with the online environment as a whole. And I think that we need to be having some of those conversations with that. We'll see what ends up happening, but I think that I agree that I don't think anything's happening in this Congress. But come 2025, between all the different state bills that you're going to have, Europe starting to implement the DSA and the Supreme Court rulings, Congress might finally be forced to act because they're going to have to start reconciling a lot of these different, likely very differing rules that are going to be happening everywhere.
Yeah. Can I just add to that? I think the one area we still do see bipartisanship is protecting kids online.
Oh yeah, very great point. Yeah.
The Kids Online Safety Act was pretty close to making it into the omnibus bill in December. It's co-sponsored by Marsha Blackburn and Blumenthal. You know, not two people who have a lot in common. There was a hearing 2 weeks ago in the Judiciary Committee that specifically addressed kids online, and actually a young person that we work with, Emma Lemke, testified, and it was the first time that a young person has gotten to testify before Congress about the role that the social media platforms have played in her life. And I think that is just one area, you know, where thank God we have one area we can agree on, and it's protecting kids online. And there is real possibility of movement. There's also significant progress being made in the states. I referenced the California Age Appropriate Design Code earlier. That's been introduced in 4 additional states right now. So, and those are bipartisan.
Yeah.
Can I just reinforce really quickly? Because I don't think we do enough panels and listen enough to people who are under, I don't know, Emma, right? Was there, I don't know how old she is, 20. And I was a fellow at Georgetown last semester and talking to a lot of my students. They are, like you said, they are using TikTok. They are using these tools. And I think we should be utilizing and talking to them more and including them more part of the conversation about understanding why they're using them, how these things have affected them, and what things they may have liked to have had in place when they first started doing so. So I just, given that we have so many influential people in the room, I wanted to make that plug.
Because they recognize the problem.
Yeah.
They know it's happening. They know what's happening to them. They're smart. These kids understand. And it just boggles my mind that instead we listen to 70-year-olds in Congress debate TikTok, and we don't invite the people who grew up with a phone in their hand to share their experience.
Jamil, any thoughts on that?
Sorry, we're very passionate about it. Jamil, thoughts?
I feel like it's been covered.
I do. How much time do we have, by the way? 5 minutes? Okay. So it was mentioned earlier that policymakers are listening and this information will, filter through our media ecosystem. And I want to get all of our panelists here to answer one question, which is that if they could advise one policy change to a leader or to a government to help make our technological ecosystem more safe and to ensure our privacy, what would that be? Just one. We can start with Katie. Why don't we start with Katie?
Transparency, but not just on data, but also transparency into the decision-making process at the companies.
Cool.
That is unfortunately my answer as well. It's really just the baseline to everything else. That's transparency is the bare minimum we should ask for and expect.
Jamil?
I agree, but for the sake of adding to the conversation here, I would say privacy legislation. I mean, in fact, I would say privacy legislation is even more important than transparency, but transparency is more achievable. There is a bill in Congress already, this Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, which I think is pretty good. Some of my colleagues wrote part of it. So they wrote the part about protecting journalists and researchers from terms of service, legal action based on terms of service. But the bill is broader and would require the companies to make certain kinds of information available to researchers, make certain kinds of information available to the public, and again, prevent them from using their terms of service to shut down legitimate journalistic and research investigation. So that's one possible model. I think that, if, so far misinformation has probably been mentioned 20 times already. I think that if that's the issue you come to all of this with, then I think privacy legislation is the best way of addressing it, because privacy legislation would restrict, not only what the companies can collect, but how finely they can target messages to particular communities. And that, I think, is the root of a lot of our a lot of the online issues relating to misinformation, is that you can target very small communities with information that is false. Nobody knows you have targeted those communities with that information, and therefore nobody's in a position to counter those messages. Which is one of the things that distinguishes the online environment from the kind of prototypical or the ideal of the marketplace of ideas, where false speech can be corrected with true speech.
Mhm.
That's not true online, because everybody sees the world through a straw online, right? You have your own private sphere. That's not my image. I think that's Zainab Tufekci's image, but I think it's a very good one. You don't know how your neighbor is experiencing the public square, because there is no public square. There's only this, very narrow vision that you have of the public square, and then they have a completely different vision of it. But privacy legislation would go, I think, a considerable distance towards addressing that problem by restricting the ability of platforms and their users to target misinformation at small communities.
Thank you. Thank you to Jamil Jaffer, Nicole Gill, Katie Harbath. Please join me in giving our panelists a round of applause.